The quiet before the storm. The galaxy had seen many battles. Wars between species were common, and fleets clashed over resources, power, and dominance. But none of them had ever faced something like this before. Deep within the outer reaches of the galaxy, there was a quiet ship, the Lifeline. It wasn't a ship meant for combat, but it was far from helpless. The Lifeline was a hospital ship, designed to carry the wounded, to heal those in need, no matter their species. Its purpose was to save lives, not to destroy them. Yet today, it would become the focus of an invasion that no one could have predicted. The attackers, a ruthless alien fleet known for their conquest and cruelty, had been watching the Lifeline for months. From their hidden observation posts, they saw it as an easy target. A hospital ship, after all, could never stand up to their might. It was a symbol of peace and vulnerability. They assumed it was a ship without any defenses, a simple, unarmed target that they could easily take control of. But what the invaders didn't know was that the Lifeline was no ordinary ship. Behind its peaceful exterior lay a ship built by Deathworlders. The Deathworlders, known for their brutal survival instincts and unmatched combat skills, had designed the Lifeline with something far more dangerous than weapons: strategy. The fleet that targeted the Lifeline was massive. Hundreds of ships, each bristling with weapons, approaching the peaceful hospital with the intent to destroy. They had no idea who they were about to challenge. On board the Lifeline, the crew was going about their daily routines, unaware of the impending threat. Doctors, medics, engineers, and nurses, all working to help those in need, not realizing that a storm was about to hit. The calm hum of the ship's systems filled the halls as the crew moved through their duties. But not everyone was so unaware. Captain Zira, the leader of the ship, had been a warrior in her past life. Though she now wore the white coat of a healer, her mind still carried the sharp edge of a seasoned soldier. She had spent years in battle, surviving on death worlds, and her instincts never failed her. She stood on the bridge, looking out into the stars. Her eyes narrowed as she felt a shift in the air. Something was wrong. The galaxy was quiet, but there was an odd tension, something that made her hairs stand on end. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was important. "Commander Rylos," Captain Zira said, her voice steady but urgent, "keep an eye on the scanners. I have a feeling we're being watched." Rylos, the ship's second-in-command, gave her a confused glance but didn't question her. He turned to the console and began to scan the area. "Nothing unusual, Captain. It's quiet out here." But Captain Zira's instincts told her otherwise. She had been through too many wars to ignore this feeling. She walked over to the communications officer and spoke in a low voice. "Alert all medics and engineers to their stations. If anything happens, we may need to respond fast." As the ship's crew continued their duties, the invaders made their move. They had been hiding in the dark corners of the galaxy, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. They were experienced in battle, and they knew exactly what they were doing. The attacking fleet slowly advanced toward the Lifeline, their ships moving into position. They had studied the hospital ship carefully, mapping out every inch of its hull, understanding its operations. They believed they had the element of surprise, that their overwhelming numbers and firepower would make this a quick and easy mission. But there was something they hadn't counted on: the Deathworlder blood that ran through the ship's very design. The Lifeline had been built to survive the harshest conditions in the galaxy, and its systems were more advanced than anything the attackers could have imagined. Captain Zira's eyes grew sharper as she stood on the bridge, scanning the horizon. The feeling in the air was growing heavier, and it wasn't just the tension of a potential attack. It was something far deeper. "Commander, status report," she said, her voice calm but filled with urgency. Rylos's hands flew across the control panel as he ran another scan. His face grew pale as the results came in. "Captain, there are multiple ships approaching. It's a full-scale attack. They're not coming to negotiate." Zira's eyes hardened. She had expected something like this. The galaxy had long underestimated the Deathworlders, and now They would learn the true cost of underestimating them. "The battle begins now," Zara whispered to herself. Her hand moved to the console, her fingers pressing a sequence of commands. Slowly, the ship's systems came to life. Hidden weapons began to power up. Shields flickered into existence, not yet fully visible but stronger than anything the attackers had ever encountered. The Lifeline was no longer a simple hospital ship. It was now a fortress, ready to defend itself. The attacking fleet had no idea what they were about to face. The moments leading up to the inevitable battle were filled with a strange calm. The ship, the Lifeline, once a haven of peace and safety, now hummed with a low, threatening energy. Its crew moved with purpose, preparing for what they knew was coming, even though they didn't yet fully understand the magnitude of the threat. Captain Zira stood at the bridge, her eyes fixed on the display screens as they showed the advancing alien fleet. Their ships were massive, their weapons formidable. But Zira had seen this before, in battles on distant Deathworlds, where the odds seemed stacked against survival. She knew the first rule of any fight: never underestimate your enemy. She turned to her second-in-command, Commander Rylos, his face set in grim determination. "How much time do we have?" she asked, her voice steady. Rylos glanced at the readouts. "They're within striking distance now, Captain. They'll be within our range in 5 minutes." Zira nodded. The calm she'd felt earlier had faded, replaced with the cool, controlled focus of a leader preparing for war. The Lifeline wasn't just a hospital ship. It was a vessel built to survive, to fight if necessary. And survive it would. "Activate defensive systems," Zara commanded. "Prepare the crew. We're not going down without a fight." Across the ship, the quiet routine of healing and care was replaced with the sharp sound of boots on the floor as the crew moved into their battle stations. Medics turned to engineers, nurses grabbed weapons, and every crew member knew what was expected. They had all been trained to fight, not just to heal. As the ship's advanced defense systems powered up, hidden turrets rose from their concealed chambers. Energy shields crackled to life, and the Lifeline became a fortress of technology and Deathworlder ingenuity. Yet, the alien invaders still had the advantage of numbers and surprise on their side. Back on the bridge, Zira stared at the ship's main screen, watching the approaching fleet. Her mind raced, calculating the odds. She knew that the enemy wasn't just coming to invade. They were coming to annihilate. They'd taken down weaker ships before. They believed that the Lifeline, a peaceful hospital vessel, would be an easy conquest. But they hadn't factored in the Deathworlder influence embedded in every bolt and circuit of the ship. Every defensive measure had been designed with one purpose: to turn the tide of battle, to make sure that if the ship was attacked, it would respond with the full fury of a Deathworlder warrior. Zira's fingers danced over the console, bringing up tactical maps of the area. The invaders were closing in fast. She'd anticipated that their first move would be to send in their fighters, followed by a bombardment of the ship's outer defenses. It would be a tactic many alien species had used before, but Zira wasn't worried. She had seen it all. "What's the status of our shields?" she asked. "Shields at full capacity, Captain," Rylos replied. "They won't be able to break through them easily, but they're still coming in hard. Expect to take fire any second now." The tension in the room thickened. Every crew member on the bridge was silent, focused entirely on their tasks. Zira felt a calm, controlled energy flooding her veins. This was what she had trained for. This was why the Lifeline had been built: to survive, to protect, to strike back. On the screen, the enemy fleet began to split into formation. The fighters moved to engage first, their sleek ships darting forward like fast-moving shadows. Zira could see the glint of their weaponry, their plasma cannons charging up. "We're about to get their attention," Rylos said, his voice low. "I expect nothing less," Zira responded. She turned her gaze to the comms officer. "Send a message to all crew members. Prepare for battle. We are Deathworlders, and we will defend this ship." The comms officer nodded and quickly relayed the order. The crew needed to know that they weren't just defending the ship. They were defending their very survival. As the enemy fighters closed in, Zira looked at the countdown clock ticking down on the screen. The tension in the room was unbearable, but Zira held her nerve. "Stand by," she said, her voice calm, but filled with authority. "We're not running. We're standing our ground." The first volley of enemy fire was sudden, a powerful strike that rocked the ship. The lifeline shuddered, but the shields held, and the enemy fire splashed harmlessly against the energy barrier. "Shields holding steady, Captain," Rylos reported, his voice tinged with surprise. "They're hitting us with everything they've got, but we're holding strong." Zira's eyes narrowed. The enemy might have underestimated the ship, but now they were learning the truth. The first wave of attacks had done nothing, but the invaders weren't backing down. They'd expected the ship to crumble. Instead, they had found an unexpected opponent. The lifeline, a symbol of healing, now a symbol of unrelenting defense. "We're just getting started," Zira muttered under her breath. "Let them come." The calm before the storm had ended. The battle for the lifeline had begun. The air aboard the lifeline grew thick with tension. Outside, the alien fleet closed in on the ship with terrifying speed. The countdown clock on the bridge ticked down to 0, and the quiet hum of the engines was replaced by the shrill sound of alarms. The first wave of enemy fighters was upon them. Captain Zira stood tall, watching the screen, her fingers clenched on the edge of the console. Her eyes locked onto the incoming fighters, their sleek, agile designs streaking through the void. They were fast, but they were not invincible. Zira had been prepared for this. She knew what needed to be done. "Initiate countermeasures," she ordered, her voice calm but firm. "Engage the enemy with full force." Rylos turned to the weapons systems officer, nodding. "Launch all defensive drones, now." At Zira's command, the ship's hidden defenses came to life. A swarm of sleek, fast-moving drones shot out from hidden launch bays. They darted toward the approaching fighters with incredible precision, disrupting their attacks and tearing through the enemy lines. For a brief moment, the enemy fighters scattered, surprised by the strength of the counterattack. Zira watched the screen as the drones weaved in and out, dodging enemy fire and launching their own retaliatory strikes. The ship's advanced weapons systems kicked in as well. Railguns and energy cannons fired in quick succession, their explosive power cutting through the darkness of space. "Direct hit on one of their ships," Rylos shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and satisfaction. But even as the enemy faltered for a moment, they quickly adapted. Zira could see their movements shift, coordinated and calculated. They weren't going to retreat. They were going to strike harder. "Incoming missiles," shouted the sensor officer. Zira's heart raced, but her face remained stoic. She had seen this before, in far more dangerous situations. "Activate the point defense systems," she ordered. The ship's point defense cannons fired to life, shooting down the incoming missiles with pinpoint accuracy. Each explosion was a burst of light in the cold blackness of space, but the enemy was relentless. More missiles came, more fighters arrived, and each one seemed determined to destroy them. "Shields holding at 80%, reported Rylos. "But they're pushing us hard." Zira's mind raced. The ship was holding, but just barely. Every hit from the enemy chipped away at their defenses, and the ship's resources were starting to thin. If they didn't end this battle soon, they would be overwhelmed. "Commander," Zira said, her voice cutting through the chaos, "target their command ship. We need to cripple their coordination." Rylos nodded sharply. All weapons locked onto their flagship. The moment Zira gave the command, the ship's weapons fired again, more focused than ever before. The first blast ripped through the enemy command ship's hull, sending debris flying into the void. Another shot. Another hit. The command ship started to break apart, its shields failing under the concentrated assault. "We've breached their flagship," the weapons officer shouted. "They're losing control of their fleet." Zira didn't smile. The fight was far from over. The destruction of the flagship had crippled the enemy's ability to coordinate, but it hadn't ended the battle. The invaders were still numerous, and the lifeline was only one ship. But as the enemy struggled to regroup, Zira saw an opening. The enemy's next wave of ships seemed disorganized, their formations broken. They were rattled. Their confidence had been shaken, and that was all Zira needed. "Prepare for a full offensive," Zira commanded. "Launch everything we've got." They're on the back foot now. With a sense of precision that only a Deathworlder ship could execute, the Lifeline's weapons systems lit up once again. But this time, it wasn't just a defensive reaction. It was an all-out strike, coordinated and merciless. Drones, energy blasts, and missiles all fired in perfect unison, turning the tide of the battle. The remaining enemy fighters were torn apart in waves, their ships exploding into bright, fiery lights against the dark canvas of space. On the bridge, the crew was silent, their faces focused. They knew the battle was far from over, but this moment was a victory, a hard-earned one. The invaders had come expecting an easy conquest, but they had found themselves in the midst of a battle unlike any they had ever faced. Zira stepped forward, looking out over the chaotic battlefield. "Hold the line," she said, her voice firm. "We've only just begun." The silence on the bridge was thick as the crew watched the aftermath of the first strike. The enemy fleet was reeling, their flagship in ruins, and their fighters scattered across the void. For a brief moment, it seemed like victory might be within reach. But Captain Zira knew better. She had seen battles turn with the flip of a switch, and this fight was far from over. "Report," she barked, her voice steady but intense. Rylos, her weapons officer, was the first to speak. "The enemy is regrouping, Commander. They're forming new formations, smaller, more agile. They're trying to overwhelm us with numbers." "How many ships?" Zira asked, her gaze never leaving the view screen. "At least 30 more ships are incoming, all of them armed to the teeth," Rylos answered grimly. The crew of the Lifeline braced themselves. This was the real test, the moment where all their preparation, all their training, would be pushed to its limits. The first strike had been a victory, but it had also opened a dangerous door. The enemy wasn't going to retreat now. They were angry. They were hungry for revenge. Zira clenched her fists and straightened her back. "They won't break us. Prepare for the worst." As the new wave of enemy ships closed in, Zira's mind raced. The ship was wounded, its shields down to 60%, and its resources were depleting. The drones were still in operation, but they couldn't sustain this level of combat forever. If the enemy closed the gap and attacked in full force, it could be disastrous. "Activate emergency shields," Zira commanded, "and reroute power to weapons. We need to end this now." The energy around the bridge hummed as systems adjusted. The ship's emergency shields powered up, and weapons began to pulse with growing intensity. The crew moved with precision, their training evident in every movement. They were prepared, but there was no guarantee that it would be enough. On the view screen, the enemy ships were closing in. They were fast, far faster than the Lifeline, and they knew it. Their smaller, more maneuverable ships began to dart toward them, closing the distance rapidly. Zira knew their strategy: surround them, cut off escape routes, and overwhelm them with sheer firepower. It was a strategy that had worked countless times before, and it was the one thing the Lifeline could not afford to fall into. "Activate evasive maneuvers, all decks," Zira ordered. "Keep them off balance." The ship lurched into motion as the crew began evasive maneuvers, the ship shifting in unpredictable directions to avoid the enemy's oncoming barrage. The massive ship swerved in a tight arc, twisting and turning, with a surprising amount of agility for its size. The crew's skill and Zira's leadership were evident as the ship glided through the incoming fire with ease, dodging explosions that lit up the dark expanse of space. But the enemy was relentless. The first barrage had failed, but they weren't giving up. A second wave of missiles shot toward the ship, their targets locked and their destruction imminent. Zara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched them approach. "Point defense systems, engage," she ordered. The smaller point defense cannons came alive, sending rapid bursts of laser fire at the missiles. The enemy had learned their lesson, however, and deployed decoy drones to confuse the lifeline sensors. The first few missiles were intercepted, but others slipped through, impacting the ship's outer hull with a violent shake. The lights flickered as the ship rocked from the impact. Sparks flew from the control panels as damage reports flooded in. The hull groaned, but it held strong. Zara knew the lifeline was built to withstand this kind of punishment, but how long could it hold out before the damage became too severe? "Damage report," she demanded. The chief engineer's voice crackled over the comms. "Hull integrity at 75%. We've lost several secondary systems, communications, some auxiliary weapons. Shields holding at 50%. Zara's mind raced. They were losing the fight slowly, and every second they wasted was another second the enemy gained. But there was still hope. The lifeline wasn't done yet. "All crew, brace yourselves," Zara said, her voice steady, though a flicker of anxiety tugged at her gut. "We're going to take the fight to them." The enemy's next volley was coming, but this time, Zara wasn't going to wait for them to come to her. She was going to strike first. "All weapons, lock on to the enemy's core ships," she commanded. "On my mark. Fire." The weapon systems roared to life once again. The ship's guns, cannons, and railguns released a devastating barrage. Energy blasts streaked across space, tearing into the ranks of the enemy ships. The lifeline fired without hesitation, relentless, showing no mercy. One by one, the enemy ships began to explode. The invaders had underestimated the Deathworlder ship's ability to counterattack. They had expected weakness after the first wave of battle, but what they didn't realize was that the crew of the lifeline was forged in the fire of countless battles. They would not go down without a fight. "Another one down," Rylos shouted, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and determination. "We've got this, Commander." But Zara's eyes remained focused on the battle. The enemy was still coming, more ships than they had anticipated. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. "We hold the line," she said quietly, her voice carrying over the chaos. "We end this here." The sound of alarms blared throughout the lifeline as the ship lurched violently once again. Sparks flew from the walls, and the shaking of the deck sent a ripple of fear through the crew. They had already sustained significant damage, but the enemy wasn't letting up. Every single one of their ships seemed determined to break through the Deathworlder hospital ship's defenses. "Report," Zara barked, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. Her eyes scanned the damage readouts flashing on the control screens, her heart pounding in her chest. There were too many casualties already. Her crew had taken hits, their spirits shaken, but they had not given up. This battle was far from over, and as the captain, she couldn't afford to let her crew lose hope. "Shields are down to 40%. We've lost a lot of external turrets, and some secondary systems are offline," Rylos, the weapons officer, reported. "But we're still holding, Commander. For now." Zara gritted her teeth, trying to ignore the mounting tension in her chest. "We won't last much longer like this. Where's the backup fleet?" There was a long pause, the tension thick in the air. Then the comms officer, Talia, spoke, her voice tight. "They're still 2 hours out, Commander. They're delayed. We're on our own." A bitter laugh escaped Zara's lips. 2 hours. They didn't have 2 hours. The enemy was too strong, and with each wave of missiles and fighters, the lifeline was growing weaker. Every second that passed meant another crack in their defenses, another injury to the crew. She could almost feel the walls of space closing in. Suddenly, a brilliant idea sparked in her mind, as though fate had whispered it to her in that moment of desperation. It was risky, almost reckless, but it was their best chance, if they could only buy themselves some time. "Activate the pulse cannons," she ordered, her voice now filled with urgency. "Full power to the pulse cannons. Aim for their fighter squadrons and try to break their formations. I want them scattered. Now." The crew hesitated for just a second before snapping into action. The pulse cannons were powerful but limited in number and range. They hadn't been used much in combat, as they had been mainly designed for emergency situations, precisely this kind of dire scenario. The ship was vulnerable, yes, but Zira knew that they had to strike back with everything they had. As the order was relayed, the ship's powerful pulse cannons hummed to life. Brilliant beams of concentrated energy shot out, cutting through the vastness of space like lasers, striking the oncoming enemy fighters. They exploded into clouds of debris, their formations splintering as Zira's crew managed to take down several ships in a matter of seconds. A glimmer of hope sparked among them. "We've got them on the run," Rylos exclaimed, his voice full of disbelief and hope. "They're breaking off. A few more hits like that, and they'll scatter." Zira didn't allow herself to feel relief just yet. There was still too much left to do. She needed to keep the pressure on the enemy and push them into retreat. But this small victory, this one step forward, was the edge they needed. It was the opening they had been desperately searching for. "Keep firing," Zira commanded, her voice firm and clear. "I don't care if we run out of power. Keep those cannons firing." The sound of weapons firing filled the bridge, a continuous, rhythmic hum that echoed through the steel walls of the lifeline. The enemy ships were still coming, but now they were retreating, a small portion of their forces left in shambles. They had not expected the hospital ship to fight back like this. Zira could see it, could feel it. This was the beginning of the turn of the tide. The enemy was realizing the true nature of the Deathworlders. They had underestimated the ship, underestimated the crew, and now they were starting to pay the price. As the Lifeline's pulse cannons ripped through the darkness of space, the enemy's advanced ships began to hesitate, their formation breaking apart. Zira knew they were trying to regroup, but the damage had been done. The psychological blow had been struck. In the silence that followed, there was a brief moment of hope. The crew began to breathe easier, the tension on the bridge lifting just slightly. Zira took a deep breath, her gaze fixed on the chaos unfolding in front of her. "They're retreating," Talia shouted in disbelief. But Zira wasn't convinced yet. Not until every last ship was gone, not until they had secured their victory. She had seen many battles turn with the slightest shift. The enemy might be retreating, but they were unpredictable. This wasn't over. "Prepare for another attack," Zira ordered, her eyes narrowing as she surveyed the damage reports. "We don't stop until the last of them is gone. Get ready for the next wave." Her heart was racing, but her determination was as strong as steel. They had taken the first step toward victory. Now it was time to finish the fight. The ship's hull trembled again as another round of missiles slammed into the lifeline. The alarms screamed, and Zira's heart pounded against her ribs. She had been hoping for a moment of respite after their brief success, but it was clear the enemy wasn't done. If anything, they were more determined than ever to crush the Deathworlder hospital ship. "Damage report," Zira barked, her eyes flicking from one screen to another, her mind racing. "Shields are down to 20%, Rylos reported, his voice tight with tension. "We've got breaches in multiple sections of the ship. Some of the lower decks are compromised. Commander, we're losing pressure." The words hit Zira like a physical blow. Losing pressure meant they were running out of time. The crew had already sustained heavy damage, and it wasn't clear how much longer the lifeline could hold out. But Zira's determination didn't waver. She had seen death, destruction, and chaos before, and none of it had ever broken her resolve. "Deploy the emergency bulkheads and seal off the compromised areas," Zira ordered, her voice cool but urgent. "We fight on. We won't let them have the lifeline." "Yes, Commander," Rylos replied, his hands flying over the controls. A loud hiss echoed through the bridge as the emergency bulkheads slammed into place, securing the more critical areas of the ship. Zira looked at her crew, their faces grim, but she could see the spark of determination in their eyes. They weren't giving up. The enemy had clearly underestimated the strength of the Deathworlders. They had expected the hospital ship to break under the pressure, to surrender, to show weakness. But instead, they had found themselves facing something far more terrifying. As the enemy ships continued their bombardment, the crew of the Lifeline held their ground. Every attack was met with defiance, every breach was sealed, every system damage was quickly repaired. The Deathworlders were used to surviving in hostile environments, to living on the edge of death, and they weren't about to let some alien invaders take their ship without a fight. All crew members, report to their battle stations, Zara ordered. We'll hold them off until the reinforcements arrive. I don't care if we lose every ship in our fleet. We will not let them take this one. There was no hesitation in her voice, no sign of doubt. The crew knew exactly what was at stake. If they didn't hold, if they couldn't fend off the enemy, then the hospital ship and everyone aboard would fall. It was that simple. But Zara refused to let that happen. She had seen her people fight against impossible odds before, and each time they had emerged victorious. This time would be no different. We're not alone, Zira muttered under her breath as she looked out at the swirling battle in the distance. We've got this. The Lifeline shuddered as another wave of missiles hit, but this time, Zira's heart didn't race. It had become almost routine. Like a heartbeat, steady, relentless. But it would not stop. The ship was battered, but it was not broken. Enemy ships breaking off. Talia shouted suddenly, her voice filled with surprise. They're retreating. Zira's heart skipped a beat, but she didn't let herself relax. Not yet. Are they regrouping or retreating completely? She asked, her voice steady, almost cold. Talia scanned the Redouts quickly. They're pulling back, Commander. It looks like they've sustained too much damage. But we can't be sure. They may be trying to lure us into a trap. Zira's eyes narrowed as she considered the situation. It was possible. The enemy had been relentless, their tactics precise and calculated. They wouldn't just give up without a plan. But for now, this was the opening they had been hoping for. The retreat was a victory, no matter how temporary it might be. Get the message out to the fleet. Tell them we're holding, Zira said. And get me a status update on the rest of our fleet. We need to know where they are, and if they're coming to assist. As Talia worked quickly to send out the message, Zira allowed herself a brief moment to breathe. She was far from ready to celebrate, but at least for now, the pressure was lifting. It wasn't over, not by a long shot, but the retreat of the enemy forces meant that the tide of battle had shifted, if only slightly. It wasn't victory, but it was a sign that they weren't as close to defeat as the enemy might have thought. Keep your eyes open, Zira said, her voice steely. The battle isn't over until we're sure we've won. Get ready for the next phase. Her crew nodded, their resolve hardening in the face of the uncertainty ahead. They knew their job wasn't finished. The enemy could return at any moment, and they would have to be ready for whatever came next. Let's finish this, Zira said quietly, but the words carried the weight of a promise. The crew of the Lifeline would not back down. They would fight until the last. The bridge of the Lifeline was eerily quiet, the tension palpable. Zira stood at the helm, her eyes fixed on the view ahead. She could see the distant flicker of enemy ships retreating into the shadows, but she knew they wouldn't be gone for long. The brief respite had given them time to regroup, but now they were running out of time. Commander, we have incoming. Talia's voice broke through the silence, sharp and urgent. They're back. Full force. Zira's heart sank, but her expression remained steely. The enemy had retreated, but it had only been a matter of time before they came back. The question now was whether the Lifeline could withstand another assault. She glanced at her crew, their faces filled with determination. They weren't backing down. Not now. "Brace for impact," Zira ordered, her voice commanding and calm. "Deploy all remaining defensive measures. We fight to the end." The alarms blared once again, and the ship shook violently as missiles struck the outer shields. The whole ship groaned under the pressure, and Zira could feel the strain in the air around her. But they had trained for this. They had prepared for moments like these. The enemy ships were fast approaching, and Zira knew they had only moments to act. They couldn't afford to waste any time. The crew had done everything they could to fortify the ship, but without backup, they would be fighting a losing battle. Reinforcements were still on their way, but how much longer could they hold on? Zira turned to Rylos. "What's the status of the shields?" "Down to 10%, Commander," he replied grimly. "We've sustained too much damage. We can't keep up with their firepower much longer." Zira's mind raced. She had known it would come to this final stand. The enemy was relentless, and every hit they took only made the situation worse. But the crew of the Lifeline wasn't going to give up. Not now, not ever. "Is there any way we can buy ourselves more time?" Zira asked, her voice low. "We've still got a few tricks left," Rylos said, his fingers flying over the console. "I can initiate a short-range EMP burst. It won't stop them for long, but it might disrupt their targeting systems just enough for us to make a move." Zira nodded. It was risky, but they didn't have the luxury of time. "Do it. Get ready to fire." As Rylos worked quickly to prepare the EMP burst, Zira turned her attention back to the approaching enemy fleet. Her breath caught as she watched the ships move into position. They were circling, closing in. The battle wasn't just a fight for the Lifeline. It was a fight for survival. "EMP burst ready," Rylos announced. "Firing now." The ship shuddered as the EMP pulse was launched. A bright flash of energy shot out, racing toward the enemy ships. Zira held her breath, praying that it would work. For a moment, the enemy fleet faltered. Their ships lost coordination, drifting off course, their weapons firing wildly. It was only a temporary reprieve, but it was enough. Zira seized the opportunity. "Now, attack," she shouted. Her crew responded without hesitation. They fired every weapon they had left, targeting the most vulnerable points of the enemy ships. Missiles launched, railguns fired, and the ship trembled with each strike. The enemy ships staggered under the onslaught, but Zira knew they wouldn't fall easily. "We're running low on ammo," Talia reported urgently. "We need to end this soon, or we'll be defenseless." Zira's mind raced. They had already taken a huge risk with the EMP burst, and now they were on the brink of exhaustion. But she couldn't give up. Not when they were so close. "Hold tight," Zira called out to her crew. "We're almost there." The enemy ships were starting to recover from the EMP pulse. Their weapons were powering up again, but they had taken too much damage. The Lifeline had done more than just survive. They had forced the enemy to rethink their strategy. The Deathworlders were resilient, and they had made their mark. Zira's heart pounded as she watched the enemy ships begin to retreat, their formations breaking apart. For a brief moment, she wondered if they were truly leaving or just preparing for a final, all-out assault. But as the moments ticked by, it became clear. The enemy was retreating for good. "They're pulling back," Talia shouted. "It looks like they've lost their will to fight." Zira exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It wasn't over yet, but the worst was behind them. They had fought valiantly, and it had paid off. The enemy had underestimated them, and now they would have to live with the consequences. "Good work, everyone," Zira said, her voice calm but filled with pride. "We've held them off, but stay alert. We don't know if they'll regroup." The bridge crew shared a moment of quiet relief, but they knew better than to get complacent. They would stay ready for whatever came next. As the Lifeline drifted away from the battle zone, Zira allowed herself a rare moment of victory. They had held their ground. They had proven to the galaxy, and to themselves, that no one could defeat a Deathworlder hospital ship. And now, as the stars stretched out before them, Zira knew that the lifeline would continue its mission. They had survived, and they would keep fighting for those who couldn't defend themselves. For as long as they had breath, they would fight. And no one would ever dare attack a Deathworlder hospital ship again.